Alrighty, this is the second episode of my multi-part series on how to play Drogoz. This episode will be covering mobility, that being things such as Drogoz's thrust, booster, and additional techniques that can be used for movement. If you want to learn about the basics of Drogoz, please check out the first episode, as it covers everything you need to know to pick him up. And if you want to learn how to fight with Drogoz, my next episode will be covering combat. Starting off for mobility will be the topic of Drogoz's booster. Keep in mind, thrust is Drogoz's dash ability, and the booster is his passive flight. The booster is a passive ability on Drogoz that burns a resource called booster fuel to allow him to gain height and remain in the air, with touts and loadouts able to extend its flight time. Now without wormjets, the booster is actually quite weak, but to get around that, you can increase your jump height by facing toward any wall, and this will allow Drogoz to reach much higher ledges and conserve booster fuel. Another technique you can use to help conserve your fuel is to do something called feathering. All feathering is rather than holding jump and burning all of your fuel, you instead press jump in bursts. It takes a little bit of practice, but once you get a good tempo going, you'll get roughly 40% more use out of your booster. To refuel your booster, you have to have it off. This usually means landing, but you can thrust to launch further into the air, and while the momentum lasts, let the booster recharge. This trick takes a little practice, but works due to the fact that the game only checks to see whether or not your booster is off, not if you're on the ground. If you run wormjets, you can even obtain infinite flight from this technique. The booster is great for getting places, but you don't have to use it only for flight. While on the ground, you can jump repeatedly to do what's known as bunny hopping, bee hopping for short. Bee hopping is useful due to it being a tad faster than walking, but mostly because it makes you harder to hit. Purchasing Nimble will even increase your flight speed, allowing Drogoz to jet around the map at alarming speed. Now for Drogoz's dash ability, Thrust. To go over Thrust, I'll be doing several demonstrations to show the distance you can get from the ability. Each of these demonstrations will be using the intersection on the staircase as a starting point, using combustible as the talent chosen to prevent confusion, and I'll spray where I land to get a reference on the distance. This first demonstration is how far Thrust travels without any cards to alter its strength. As you can see, the bare bones Thrust doesn't go all that far. The second demonstration here is how far Thrust travels without being boosted by Propel at level 5. Thus now goes about double the distance, but with a few tricks you can go further. The first trick is to remove the friction you have with the ground, most easily done by jumping before activating Thrust, and as you can see, that allowed for roughly 10% more distance. Now to get maximum distance, you want to use your booster after you thrust, feathering it to keep optimum momentum. Now we are starting to tread on the more complicated and less used movement. Since Drogoz deals damage in an area of effect, AoE for short, he receives self-damage if he's too close to either his primary or salvo shots. This luckily also gives him self-knockback, allowing for several tricks at the cost of ammo and a little bit of health. This first trick is a simple one. Jumping at the same time you shoot a rocket at your feet launches you higher into the air, about the same height as using a wall for increased jump height. This trick isn't one you'll use often, as any wall gets you the same height, but being good in a pinch. The self-knockback from your primary is a bit more useful when used by a wall. If you find yourself off the map and out of fuel, you can shoot slightly under yourself, but at the wall, to try and buy time to reset your thrust. Just keep in mind this trick is a tad bit finicky and a last resort. Now for distance, Drogoz's salvo can be used for some serious movement. The size of your salvo explosions, decided by the decimate card, determine the distance you get per rocket, but also the damage taken per rocket. Keep in mind the salvo size to distance traveled has diminishing returns. To do this trick, prepare your salvo, jump, and shoot it behind you but close enough to hit yourself with the rockets. While you're launching yourself, hold back and you'll go across the map in seconds. Using the salvo to move also works vertically, not just horizontally. Just aim the salvo beneath you, but at the wall, and while firing, hold forward and jump. You can make it up just about any wall, and conserve your thrust with this, or just use the salvo as a risky escape. Do note that you do take about 400 health using your salvo, and because you are knocking yourself back, both your primary shot and your salvo can break you out of a Genos Void Grip. There isn't a lot to say on what to do with Drogoz' ultimate, ult for short, besides a few things. Firstly, you can cancel the ultimate at any time by pressing it again. This can be useful for multiple things, like cancelling it before dying while the ult is on to get a 30% refund, using ultimate to get a better vantage point, or popping the ult to scare the enemy and let them back up in panic. Secondly, you are crowd control immune and ignore gravity while channeling the ult, allowing for tricks such as ulting off the side of the map, ulting above a doorway, or just denying the enemy a stun on you. Synergies between the abilities for movement I've already covered, being using booster after thrust to carry momentum, as well as using thrust to restore booster fuel, will be the ones you will most likely use the most, usually without even thinking about it. The other synergies at work involve thrust and the salvo launch. They consist of either turning around and using thrust after launching yourself with your salvo, or doing the opposite, popping thrust and adding to the momentum with a salvo launch. The only synergy that actually doesn't work out is using booster while you have the initial boost from thrust. It won't add to the initial amount of momentum and will only consume your fuel. As you can see, Drogoz is fast once you get used to him. All you have to practice for when it comes to his mobility is fuel and cooldown management, as well as figuring out when it is a good time to commit to any of the self-knockback techniques. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments and I'll try my best to answer. In the next episode on how to play Drogoz, we'll be covering combat. If you enjoyed, please be sure to hit the like button, and if you would like to see more of my content, please be sure to subscribe. I hope you learned a few things from this, and I look forward to seeing you on the battlefield.